Hello everyone! I recently made a custom Super Mario Bros. Wonder level called Flooded Fungi. I had a couple different ideas for multiple levels that ended up being merged into this one level. First of all, I've been wanting to use these green mushrooms that stretch when touched for some time now, since the original game only uses these in a single KO arena. Secondly, I'd come up with this idea of moving liquid around using a pull handle like this. I realized I could combine these two ideas into one level, which would also mean I could have sections where mushrooms are submerged in toxic goo until they are triggered by an enemy. So I needed to find an enemy that would survive being submerged in toxic goo, and which would also work nicely alongside stretchy mushrooms, which is why I decided to use walking bone piranha plants. Due to them being a bone enemy, this also gave me a good excuse to use these bone platforms that float in liquid. I decided that I would use the stretchy player wonder effect, since this same effect also makes bone piranha plants stretch, and it would also fit with the stretchy mushrooms. The glowing pumpkin party mushrooms from the original game inspired me to modify the mushrooms that would appear in my level to make them glow in the dark, which I figured should look really cool during the stretchy wonder effect. So those were all the mechanics I decided to use. Now let's look at the level creation process. One of my favorite visuals that the original game introduced was having liquid on both the bottom and the top of the screen. So I decided to add that greenish toxic goo both above and below the player in my level. This did mean that I didn't have much vertical space to work with throughout this first half of the level. The camera in Super Mario Bros. Wonder is usually 15.5 blocks tall, so if you subtract the 3.5 blocks of the toxic goo on screen in this area, that left me with only 12 blocks of screen height to work with. This was even more of a challenge in Wonder than it would have been in other 2D Mario games, since the elephant suit makes the player 3 blocks tall. So considering these limitations, working on the first half of the level was a bit of a challenge sometimes, though I think it turned out alright. I decided to hold off on using any moving liquids until nearly halfway through the level, which means the first third of the level really only features two mechanics: stretchy mushrooms and walking bone piranha plants. Still, this didn't end up really being a problem because the stretchy mushrooms are such a versatile mechanic that I honestly could have made a level using only them if I wanted to. In fact, in general, I might as well mention that working on this level was an extremely smooth process compared to some of my other recent levels. I didn't run into any major problems that forced me to change my plans. Everything mostly just worked out the way I wanted it to. I still ran into plenty of smaller problems though, of course. For example, remember that thing I mentioned about the elephant player's hitbox being 3 blocks tall? Well, when a stretchy mushroom pushes a player up, it has this little bounce animation that pushes the player up an extra quarter of a block or so. This is a problem because if a mushroom pushes an elephant player into an area with a ceiling 3 blocks above the player's head, this tiny extra bounce is enough to crush the player for a brief moment, causing them to take damage. When I discovered this in the middle of working on this level, I thought this would be a major problem that I'd have to design my whole level around. After all, pushing the player close to a ceiling was an important part of some sections where the ceiling would feature piranha plants that the player was supposed to avoid. But the solution ended up being pretty simple. In the few sections where this elephant crushing would happen, I made the mushroom stretch about a quarter of a block lower and then lowered the surrounding terrain to match. This was enough of a difference to make the elephant player not get crushed, but this change wasn't significant enough to make the piranha plants on the ceiling not be able to hurt the player. This level's first purple 10 coin setup features a sort of puzzle thing that I'm very happy with, honestly. So in an earlier section, there's some walking bone piranha plants that trigger stretchy mushrooms hidden in the toxic goo that the player can stand on, allowing them to get across to the other side. In order to get the first purple 10 coin, the player has to lower a stretchy mushroom, allowing a piranha plant to walk over to where the collectible is floating above some toxic goo. And when the piranha plant falls in there, it once again triggers some stretchy mushrooms, allowing the player to follow it and collect the purple 10 coin. So it's like a more tricky repeat of a similar setup that appeared earlier in the level, which I think makes for a very intuitive challenge. For the final big setup before the midway flag, I decided to hook up the movement of the toxic goo to a pull handle, allowing the player to control the height of the liquid. I also made the camera follow along with the liquid vertically, which meant I didn't have to deal with the player having to manually scroll the camera up or down. The earlier parts of this area were not designed around the idea that the toxic goo at the bottom of the screen could go down, so using a mushroom platform, I made a section that would block the player from going back to an earlier part of the area. Sadly, I didn't have much control over how fast the liquid would move or how far it would go down, since some of the parameters for the pull handle don't seem to work in the way I thought they would. Still, I suppose keeping this section simple was a good thing, since the whole concept of the liquid moving down will probably be interesting enough as it is for first-time players. In fact, making sure the player couldn't easily get themselves killed by lowering the goo was one of the main concerns when designing this section, and I think I managed that pretty decently. My only remaining concern is that it might catch people off guard in multiplayer, but there isn't much I can do about that. I decided to hide a pipe that would lead to the second purple 10 coin off to the right of the lowering liquid section, meaning the player would have to rush to get into the pipe before the goo would cover it up. I didn't like the idea of having this be a one-time opportunity for the player though, so I made it to where the player can backtrack to the pull handle and try again from the right side this time. The bonus room for the second purple 10 coin is pretty simple, but also very cool to look at, I think. Wonder features these toxic waterfalls that can be moved by pull handles just as easily as normal toxic goo, so in this section I made the player move these goo waterfalls to the right, allowing them to access the purple 10 coin. Sadly, this was also the last time I used the manually moving the liquid mechanic for multiple reasons. First of all, only one pull handle can control the movement of the toxic goo, so I couldn't have multiple of these same setups in one area. I also knew that the second half of the level would feature the stretchy player transformation, and in this state, the player looks really glitchy when interacting with pull handles. So I couldn't use this idea during the wonder effect either way. Still, I didn't just want to drop this idea from the second half of the level after introducing it in the first, which is why the toxic goo in the second half of the level moved up and down continuously. This presented its own set of level design challenges, since now basically every setup in this area was dependent on the 10-second cycle of the liquid moving up and down. I've never really made a level with this kind of overarching cycle-based setup before, so I hope I managed to prevent the players from feeling like they're constantly having to wait. I tried to avoid this by having each consecutive section alternate between requiring the liquid to be up high and requiring it to be down low. That way, if the player moves through the level at a decent pace, they should be able to get through every section without really having to do any waiting. As you've probably noticed by now, mushroom platforms are some of the few objects in the game that Fushigi, the Super Mario Bros. Wonder level editor, doesn't display properly. Even though these objects have parameters that can change their width and height, messing with these doesn't affect the way Fushigi renders the mushrooms in the editor. This made working on this level a bit tedious, since I had to constantly guess at how exactly the mushrooms would fit into certain sections based on their size parameters. Still, either way, I should mention that Fushigi has finally started receiving updates again. I started working on this level using Fushigi version 1.1.7, but one day into the level creation process, version 1.2 was released, which included a bunch of quality of life improvements. Basically everything related to copy-pasting is now actually usable. So instead of having to constantly type out the names of objects that I wanted to add to the level, I could now repeatedly copy objects that I'd used before. Links can also be copy-pasted now, which would have really come in handy in my levels that featured a bunch of objects that were linked to movement assistants, though this feature was still useful whilst making this level as well. These features were added to Fushigi by a guy named Donovan Draws, so I'm very grateful to him for spending so much time and effort to make the level creation process easier. Although walking bone piranha plants do survive when they come into contact with the toxic goo, they are still affected by it, because it makes them move more slowly. This wasn't a big deal for most of the setups throughout the level, but in the second area there were a few cases where this would make the spread of the spawned walking piranha plants really inconsistent. When the piranha plants walk more slowly because of the goo, the gaps between each piranha plant that spawns become smaller compared to if they don't come into contact with the liquid at all. There wasn't really much I could do about this, it's just a strange side effect of the moving liquid that I was not expecting. As I've already talked about, the wonder effect for this level is the stretchy player transformation, which works nicely alongside the stretchy mushrooms and the bone piranha plants, which can also stretch. Another reason I wanted to use this wonder effect was because I thought the rising and lowering toxic goo on the ceiling would make for a good obstacle for the stretchy player to avoid. However, I should have thought about this a little bit more before starting work on this level, because of course when the player touches the liquid, they die instantly. Having the player instantly get killed if if they're not crouching at the right moment, felt very punishing for what was otherwise a relatively easy level, so I mostly ended up avoiding setups where this would be the case. Upshroom Downshroom, a level from the original game, has this unused silhouette lighting file that could have been used during that level's Wonder Effect. So I decided to use that same lighting file for my level's Wonder Effect, though I did change it a bit. See, the backgrounds that appear in the original game's silhouette levels were made specifically for their silhouette lighting, so they didn't feature any objects that were relatively close to the camera, because the silhouette lighting would have turned these completely black, and thus made it really difficult for the player to actually see themselves. So I ended up modifying the lighting file that was used during my Wonder Effect to make the closer background objects not completely silhouetted, which meant the player could still see themselves clearly most of the time. Apart from the transformation, the original game's stretchy player Wonder Effect sections barely change depending on whether the player has activated the Wonder Effect or not, which to me has always felt a bit off. So although I tried to design my section to feel similar to the stretchy player effect areas in the original game, I did end up making the area change quite drastically in some places if the player doesn't grab the Wonder Flower. This way, the level should still feel fun and rewarding to complete, even if the player skips the Wonder Flower for whatever reason. At some point during the level creation process, I somehow convinced myself that every type of coin gets destroyed when they come into contact with the toxic goo, when in fact it only works that way for coins that are affected by gravity. So when I started working on the Wonder Effect section, I thought I wouldn't be able to use the mini flower coins that drop down when the player crouches, but luckily I ended up simply being wrong about that. For most of my custom Wonder levels so far, I've avoided hiding purple 10 coins in the Wonder Effect sections, even though the original game does do this from time to time. The challenge of hiding a purple 10 coin in a section like this is that it would be unfair if the player could only collect it if the Wonder Effect is active, so the coin needs to be collectible either way. I ended up settling on a very simple setup where the player can crouch walk under a pipe to hit a question mark block that then spawns the 10 coin, with the challenge coming from the fact that this entire section gets periodically submerged in toxic goo. This setup works no matter if the Wonder Effect is active or not, though I suppose the silhouette lighting does make it slightly more difficult if the Wonder Effect is active. The level's goal pole is a bit of a throwback to an earlier section in the level, since it features a walking piranha plant that raises a bunch of stretchy mushrooms that form a staircase. It's pretty easy on the player's part as far as goal pole setups go, but I also think it's really elegant and fitting for the level's mechanics. So now the last thing that was left to do was to decorate the level. Something I wasn't quite sure of was whether I should use the moss decorations that some of the original game's levels that feature a lot of pipes use, but as far as I can tell, in the original game, these decorations are only used in levels that appear in World 1, and either way, the green moss wouldn't really fit with the purple pipes. So I ended up sticking to the same decorations that the original game's World 4 levels used, so mainly mushrooms. And with that, the level is finished, so now it's time to play through the full thing. Okay, and here we are. So I really like how I introduce the stretchy mushrooms here in a very safe environment with those coins that get lifted up. And I mean, I suppose either way, if you don't get that secret, the mushrooms are introduced right there alongside the walking piranha plants. And yeah, those are basically this level's only two real central mechanics, because like the floating bone platforms and the rising and lowering liquid is it's not really as much of a focus in this level as I maybe thought they would be ahead of time. Here I really like this setup here where first we have the stretchy mushroom that just sort of threatens the player with the idea of getting hit by the piranha plants, and then after that you actually can get hit by those piranha plants if you don't wait for them to go into their pipe. So I think that works really nicely. And this is a setup that I really like thought a lot about ahead of time before working on the level, was the idea that the stretchy mushrooms would be below the poison or the toxic goo or whatever you want to call it, and then the walking piranha plants make it go above so the player can walk on that. And I sort of ended up using that same idea for the I'm trying to show this here. There we go. For the first purple Denkon here, where this piranha plant is going to fall into the goo, and that's going to raise up some mushrooms that we can then also walk on. That pipe there is just there for the piranha plant. You can't actually enter that. In general, I tried to take a lot of advantage of the fact that walking piranha plants basically enter any pipe they come into contact with, which is nice because it basically despawns them, and that means I don't have to constantly deal with all these piranha plants spawning over and over again. And yeah, here we have the epic rising and lowering toxic goo section, which yeah, I think it's really cool. It's a shame I couldn't use this more throughout the level. Honestly, I do think this mechanic has enough potential to where I might bring it back for a future level, maybe with like lava or something like that. because I think it is pretty cool. It is a bit precarious doing the pull handle thing from the other side, like I just demonstrated, but that allows us to get into this bonus room here, which this bonus room is like nothing special in terms of difficulty or like, I don't know, creativity or anything. It's just very, very cool to look at, and I think just kind of a cool idea. But in terms of actual gameplay, there's nothing that interesting about it, but I suppose that's fine. I really like that talking flower there, which is, I guess, gasping for air because it's been submerged in toxic goo for some time. I should have maybe made that just happen every time, but that would have probably been annoying, so he only does that once, and then after that he's just quiet. You can get into, or not into, you can get up here using this moving pipe, which it is interesting that this is the only like element in the level, apart from some coins here and there, that move along with the goo. And I mean, I guess there's also the bone platforms, but that's more logical. But I just sort of came up with this idea of like, what if this one pipe is moving along, and I think that's fine. Here we spawn some of these bone platforms with the mini Wonder Buds, and I think that's a sort of interesting way of using these platforms. Though for the most part, those didn't end up being a big focus in the level, like I already talked about. Also because, like, during the stretchy player wonder effect, the bone platforms, like, they don't glow or anything like that. So they're just these, like, dark platforms that you can barely see due to the toxic goo. Like, you can barely see what I'm standing on right now. So therefore I decided not to really have those be a big focus during the wonder effect, which basically meant that they didn't show up during the second half of the level here at all. This wonder effect is, I think, pretty cool. It is a bit difficult, like I talked about during the time-lapse, and also it's a bit short, maybe because it's kind of difficult. I didn't want the player to have too many opportunities to screw up, basically. So for example, this section here, it's quite treacherous how that stretchy mushroom can just send you into the toxic goo at the top of the screen. Here we have to wait for the goo to lower down, and now we can get this question mark block, which spawns the third purple 10 coin there. And that works regardless of whether we have the wonder effect active or not. That mini bud there spawns some of those mini coins, which we can collect by ducking down like that, which is obviously how it always works for the stretchy player wonder effect. And yeah, here we're basically at the end of the section already. Like I said, it's a bit short, but I suppose that's fine because it is also a bit difficult. Over here we have another, we have a mini bud that spawns some more coins, which is just a way of keeping the player kind of busy whilst waiting for the toxic goo to go down, so they can jump onto that mushroom, which allows them to go into the pipe. And here's the gold pole setup, which, yeah, I think this is pretty cool, just a very, very simple setup, and I think very fitting for this level's mechanics. And before I end this video, I should also show off some of the non-wonder version of some of the sections and whatnot. So you can actually skip this section by doing that with the bubble and activating that Wonder Bud, which is something that I sort of included intentionally because I thought it would be a cool speedrun skip. And also here you can see that this is what the section normally looks like if you don't go through with the bonus pipe. Okay, and now we're in this section and I'm not going to grab the Wonder Flower. And as you can see, for the most part, it's pretty similar. Like these blocks here are still at the ceiling, and well, down here there is no longer a Wonder Bud that like makes that pipe with the Piranha Plant move up, so that's a bit different. And here we have a Piranha Plant pipe generator, which is also very different because there wouldn't be if I put the Piranha Plant down lower like there is during the Wonder effect, that wouldn't be a threat. As you can see here, the purple 10 coin is a bit different if you don't have the Wonder effect active, but you can still get it. And this section is a bit different as well because of the stretchy mushroom that I added, because that way the walking piranha plants are still a bit of a threat. Also, it is funny how all of the enterable pipes in the level are either like red or I guess in this case lime green, which is a pipe color you don't really see much of. Yeah, but I suppose we're now at the end of the level and also at the end of this video, guys. So if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and consider subscribing. Maybe also consider joining my Discord server, which is linked in the description, and you can become a channel member or whatever. Thank you guys so much for watching. See you later, and bye-bye.